Now, let's start in Ethiopia, where more high-profile figures are joining the call to arms of the Ethiopian government. A number of celebrated athletes, including the sporting legend Haile Gebrselassie, now say they are going to the front line to fight, following a similar declaration by the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. This as fighters from the Tigray People's Liberation Front advance from the north towards the capital, Addis Ababa. The UN says it's evacuating the families of international staff from the country. On the diplomatic front, the US Horn of Africa envoy Jeffrey Feltman, along with the African Union envoy, the former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, are warning that escalating fighting threatens diplomatic progress towards a ceasefire. Well, for more about this, I'm joined now by the Ethiopian academician, author and lecturer, Dr. Awol Allo, who is in the UK. Dr. Allo, thank you very much indeed for joining us. So a day after the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed said he would go to the battlefront to protect the capital, there's a new twist with the sporting legend Haile Gebrselassie pledging to fight with him. What's your reaction to that?
Yes, a day after that dramatic announcement by the Ethiopian Prime Minister that he will go to the battlefront and command the armed forces, now we have a plethora of high-profile athletes and other individuals who are basically declaring their intentions to follow in the path of the Prime Minister and fight for their country. I think what this really shows is that the situation has changed so dramatically that the Prime Minister feels the need to personally go to the war front. Remember when this war started in November last year, the Prime Minister told the Ethiopian people, the world, that this is going to be a very short surgical operation with a very limited and achievable objective. Well, a year on, the rebel forces have come so close to Addis, within about 200 kilometers of the capital city, and the government has to leave its main seat, and the Prime Minister basically going to the war front to lead the campaign, as if his military generals, his field commanders are incapable, and somewhat he can do what they have failed to do.
So it is your sense then, Dr. Allo, that this is a desperate move because, I mean, we appear to be seeing government-backed forces falling to those Tigrayan soldiers who you would have thought would not be as well equipped as the Ethiopian army.
Absolutely. I mean, when this war started, nobody really expected, not even Tigrayan military generals and the Tigrayan leadership expected for things to take the kind of turn they have taken. It's not just the Ethiopian armed forces, it's also the Eritrean armed forces, the Amhara militia. Tigray was essentially cornered from all directions. So the assumption on the part of so many observers was that Tigray would be defeated within a short period of time. But of course, they will continue to resist, and the country would kind of fall into a grinding insurgency. Now, in June last year, Tigrayans decisively forced the Ethiopian military out of Tigray region and then went on to capture significant territories in neighboring regions of Tigray, in the neighboring regions of Amhara and Afar. Now they are very close to Addis Ababa, reaching the Oromia regional state, and it has really come to a point where the question of whether or not the government can continue became the most important question that people have been talking about over the last few days. So the fact that the Prime Minister has to make this decision shows very clearly, I think, how desperate the situation is. I think he's simply saying that instead of waiting in Addis, in the capital, for them to arrive, I would rather go to them and meet them there.
And beyond being a desperate move, how dangerous and irresponsible is this? Because, I mean, going to the battlefront is obviously dangerous, but also calling on people in the cities to arm themselves against the backdrop of all the ethnic tensions in the country sounds like a recipe for violence.
Absolutely. And, this is a campaign that was ethnically changed from the beginning. The prime minister has repeatedly used very controversial languages and bellicose rhetoric, calling his adversaries cancers, disease that must be erased from the face of the earth. His officials used very open genocidal language against their adversaries. And it is in this context that the prime minister has been calling on the civilian population to rise up and fight the enemy. And there was a point about a few weeks ago when Facebook removed the post by the prime minister after finding it insightful to violence. Now, we don't know whether the prime minister really is planning on going to the battlefront. Maybe this is just one way of trying to push one more time and mobilize people, because the way in which state media is trying to frame this is that, well, your leader who is committed to Ethiopia's greatness is in the battlefront. What about you? These are the kinds of questions that state media has been putting to people with photos of the prime minister in a military fatigue. So we don't know whether the prime minister is actually intending to do that. We cannot rule out that possibility, because this is somebody who believes that he knows everything, he knows all. And I think, he was a soldier, he was a radio operator during the Ethiopian-Eritrea war. He does not have a distinct military experience that his military generals do not have. So the idea that the prime minister, who has been, used to a comfortable life, would go to the battlefront and change the tide and reverse the advance of the rebels, that is implausible. So the strategy is perhaps, I think, to mobilize people to try and push them back one more time. But this is not the first time that this kind of call has been made. What we now have is the prime minister himself taking this very extraordinary step. We don't know, if there are some other considerations, some other calculations as part of this call. But in any event, this is a very dangerous move.
Well, as you said, it isn't clear if he's already joined the fighting, although I have to tell you that we've seen photos emerging on social media of him dressed in military fatigues in a convoy surrounded by special forces. But on the diplomatic efforts, Dr. Allo, the US Special Envoy to the Horn of Africa, Jeffrey Feltman, the African Union envoy, the former Nigerian President Olusegun Obasanjo, say both sides believe they are on the cusp of military victory. What's the latest on the mediation talks? I mean, have they borne much fruit in your assessment?
Yeah, so I think since about a couple of weeks ago, there were some developments when the Ethiopian government suddenly announced its intention to negotiate. But obviously, at the same time, both sides have continued to fight. And what we now have is a very significant escalation on both sides. So while you have an escalation of armed hostility, it's very difficult to see how these various peace initiatives would have the opportunity to lead to a meaningful talk that will ultimately lead to a ceasefire and then a negotiation to deal with the broader political disagreements and ideological disagreements in the country. And I think, just looking at Ethiopian culture, Ethiopian history, and the differences between these two groups and the abuses and atrocities that has taken place over the last 1 year, and the level of polarization and division within society, is just really difficult to see how these two actors could come together, negotiate a deal, and solve their problems politically. Now, I think both sides in this conflict believe that they are on the cusp of victory. It's not clear to me how the government side actually believes that they are on the cusp of victory, because they have lost significant territory, and they have lost territory to a rebel group. And this is an asymmetric conflict between rebel groups and states. And where rebel groups make that level of advancement, it's very difficult for the government side to make that kind of claim. the rebels very clearly are emboldened by the amount of territory they have occupied and by the way the war is going. Now, in most instances, ceasefires and political negotiations work when both parties reach what is called a mutually hurting stalemate, in the sense that neither of them believe that they are on the cusp of victory, and the status quo is very costly to both of them. When you have those kinds of situations, it's highly likely that you would have some kind of ceasefire. But in this context, the military momentum is clearly on the side of the rebels, but the government also, for whatever reason, believes that it can win this war. And so the likelihood of the two sides negotiating to resolve these problems through a peaceful political means, I think, is very limited, despite what the international actors are saying.
So, talking about that military momentum that you mentioned a short while ago, and that momentum being on the side of the rebels, I mean, how far is the front line from Addis Ababa?
Now, according to sources, the rebels now are around a town called Debrecen, which is about 200 kilometers from Addis, about 220 kilometers from the capital Addis. Now, Debrecen is in the Amhara regional states, so the population in that area very much supports the war. Once you leave the Amhara regional state, move south, you get into Oromia regional states, and the support for the war is significantly less in the Oromia regional state. And there are also the Oromo Liberation Army that is operating within the Oromo region. So the fear now is that if they go past a city called Debre Birhan, which is a major city in the Amhara regional state, then the possibility of marching to Addis without significant military resistance is very, very high. And I think that's why we are seeing this calls by the international community, various embassies, asking their citizens to leave Ethiopia immediately. And of course, this dramatic and extraordinary decision by the Prime Minister himself to go to the battlefront.
Meanwhile, Dr. Allo, the humanitarian situation continues to worsen. I mean, we understand that nearly 500,000 people are living in famine-like conditions, and millions more are facing severe hunger and are not getting the aid they need.
Absolutely. And I think one of the tragic consequences of this particular conflict and many conflicts across the African continent is the tragic impact, the catastrophic impact they have on the civilian population. So in Tigray, in the Amhara regional state, in the Afar regional states, millions of people now are facing significant humanitarian crisis, in need of food aid, and food is not getting in. In Tigray, about 1 million people, as you said, facing famine-like situation. The argument from the Tigrayan side is that they will continue to fight and weaken the capacity of the federal government until the siege on the Tigray region is broken. The Abiy government, on the other hand, has been arguing that TDF forces must return to the Tigray region. But obviously, while this is being presented as an excuse by both sides, what they really want is complete victory on each side. And given the political nature of the conflict underpinning this war, it's almost impossible to secure that kind of complete victory, particularly by the government side. So it's unfortunate that the humanitarian situation remains the same. Civilians are suffering, and I think it is highly likely that this will continue until this problem is resolved.
Dr. Awol Allo, I want to thank you very much indeed. Always appreciate your analysis. And he is, of course, the Ethiopian academician, author, and lecturer.